Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you are all well and healthy and strong to continue in this context with so many present and future challenges. I would like to begin by thanking the people who are here listening to us, dedicating their time to our panel. I am Moema Salgado, CEO of Faith in Climate, Fé no Clima, a civil society organization that is lay and based in Brazil. I also want to thank the Climate Group for the possibility of having this space for our dialogue, exchange, and action, and for keeping up the Climate Week in spite of the pandemic, which is very strong, especially in the two countries that are speaking here with us today, Brazil and the U.S. I also thank Instituto Clima e Sociedade, a great partner and supporter of our group. And most of all, I thank our speakers today, Mãe Liliana Dossum, Lourdes Brasil, Reverend Fletcher Harper, Miriam Zuyan, and Fabio Scarano. Thank you for accepting so kindly our invitation. I want to remind you of something that may seem obvious, but these meetings have been very necessary lately among civil society, indigenous groups, other communities, so that they may establish groups among themselves as well as international connections, like we are doing today, to exchange experiences, to add to their strengths, and to speak up about problems that are going on, and to explain distorted versions of reality, which we have been hearing lately. As you all know, 2020 is a very special year in several aspects. First of all, the tragic aspect and the decisive character of this year for our future. It is a year when the world was forced to stop and also got an opportunity to rethink our lives, our work, our relationships, the way we care for each other, and especially the way we care for our planet. It is a very important year politically. We have municipal elections in Brazil, and we have the presidential elections in the United States. It is important to keep in mind that the decisions which will be made this year will be determinant for our future. 2020 also includes some celebrations and anniversaries that we insist on at the Fé do Clima group. The Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, a demand or a request to stop environmental degradation and deforestation. We also have the 5 years of the Paris Agreement, which we are hearing a lot about during this Climate Week, and also 5 years of our Fé no Clima group, joining different groups, including Reverend Harper here with us, in a movement to commit to the different Faith for Climate groups. Although it was founded in 2015, the inspiration for this group comes from previous movements, especially the interreligious or interfaith movement that was founded in the 1992 World Summit, which we here know as ECO 92. The group tries to promote dialogues between and among different groups of faith, scientists, environmentalists, gathering knowledge that might seem conflicting, but which are actually very supplementing. Also aimed at informing and facing actions that strengthen climate change. So we want to incentivize interfaith interaction, because although we have a variety of beliefs and faiths, all of them essentially defend life. And if they defend life, they must also defend our planet from this environmental crisis. And they must also defend the most vulnerable populations, which already suffer from the climate crisis and now, as we are seeing, from the health crisis. Well, I will not go any further. I will give the floor to Fabio Scarano, but just some logistics announcements. We have 5 to 10 minutes for each speaker, and then we will have an exchange with the public, which can send their questions through the YouTube chat that you are probably seeing now. I will introduce our guests rapidly, and then I will give the floor to Fabio Scarano. Fabio Scarano is a forest engineer. He has a PhD in environment, and he is an ecology professor since 1983. He has worked for the Botanical Gardens and several other organizations, academic, as well as the UN Panel for the Climate and Biodiversity. One point that brings Fabio very close to our dialogue is his current main interest, which is the dialogue between science and other forms of knowledge. This is our moderator. Reverend Fletcher Harper is an Episcopal preacher and the executive director of Greenfaith, a North American environmentalist organization which is important in several continents around the world. He is a pioneer in the environmental and religious movement, and he has been working against fossil fuels besides a diversity of other activities. Reverend Harper is our very important partner at Fenoclima. Lourdes Brasil is the director of the Environmental Education Center Genesis, a researcher and member of the Baptist Church from Niterói. She has 2 PhDs on psychosociology, and she therefore gathers 2 faces of our dialogue: faith and engagement on the one hand, and the scientific environmentalist face on the other. Meeting Zhu Yang, a young member of the Guarani population, member of the Indigenous Council of the Federal District. He is studying geography, and he is the articulator of the Engajamundo group, a national and internationally engaged group, among others with regards to environment. Mãe Liliana Dochun is a journalist, a scientist of religious scientists, Yalorixá and Yanifa, and very much engaged with human aspects and the peace culture. We will come back to speaking about and with you several times. But before I give the floor to Fabio Scarano, our moderator, and we hope we have a very good event. Good afternoon, my friends, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be with you and to see my friend Moema. Moema, thank you so much for this invitation. I also want to send my greetings to my friends at ISER. I would like to say how happy I am to be with Lourdes again in another remote meeting. And today I have the opportunity of meeting Reverend Fletcher, Mother Liliana meeting, who is in the same university where I studied, the UNB in Brasilia. And therefore I believe we will have a very pleasant afternoon and a very good conversation. I would like to begin rapidly by offering a context of this present moment that we are experiencing. And I would like to go back to 2007 when the IPCC was launched. This report, or the report of the IPCC, which won the Nobel Peace Prize. So 13 years ago, the report mentioned that our society had entered the era of adaptation, meaning that it was no longer useful or sufficient to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but more than that, we had to adapt to a planet that was already warming up. 7 years later, in 2014, the IPCC concluded that the human systems that were most vulnerable to climate change were the poorer communities. It also concluded that the more vulnerable natural systems were those that lost their capacity to support life. That is, the systems that lost their nature. The conclusion of this report is that so that we can adjust to better climate conditions, we need to adjust to nature. And in the process, we need to reduce poverty and social inequality. I believe that this is a very important convergence for our conversation because all the faith communities are worried about reducing poverty, and at the same time they are worried with the conservation of nature. And this is a common point between the faith communities and science. And this is something that joins these two groups. And this is why I believe it's so important to have a dialogue between faith, spirituality, and science, especially now when we have a very short deadline. The Paris Agreement, as well as the 2030 Agenda, say that we have 10 years to proceed with this change, to preserve nature and to reduce poverty. And we need to do this during these 10 years so that life is not so different than what we know it. So it is a very short period, 10 years. And in the middle of that, we have the pandemic, COVID-19, this very difficult moment. And this situation brings two impacts. One, it strengthens the fact that vulnerability has to do with poverty and with a degradation of nature. The other impact of COVID, which is specifically concerning, is that if we already had a very difficult challenge for 10 years, it is an additional barrier in this very short time we have. So it is clear that we need science more than ever to bring solutions, but that we also need faith to bring us hope in humankind and in our planet and in the fact that we can get out of this situation. Now coming over to Brazil, in brief, we are the second country in deaths caused by COVID after the United States. Our forests and natural ecosystems are in flames, differently from what is happening in California, which is a direct impact of climate change. Here in Brazil, these fires are arson. And we had very high emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, is exactly because of the fires. And to add to that, in the beginning of the week in the UN conference, our president suggested in his speech a certain antagonism between religion and science when he mentioned Christophobia, and he mentioned scientific data about the fires in Brazil, which were surveyed by the government, which is in fact responsible for fighting against these fires. So in this scenario, we have this very, very special group of guests, people of faith, who at the same time are in constant dialogue with science, especially with the beautiful program led by Moema, Faith in Climate. But one thing that I would like to hear from you is whether in your religious community you perceive this antagonism between faith and science, as our Brazilian president suggested. Having said that, I would like to give the floor to Reverend Fletcher Harper to give us some of his vision and experience about the topic. Reverend, you have the floor.
Thank you. Muito obrigado. And thank you so much for the chance to be with you. I'll speak in Spanish in English because I am good in English. I'm so in Spanish, and I'm not good in Portuguese. So I'm sorry about that, but that is in no way an indication of any lack of fondness and affection for my colleagues at ICER and Fenoclima, and for the many wonderful colleagues in Brazil that I've had the opportunity to collaborate with over the past decade. It's been a real pleasure, and it's wonderful to be together today. I'd like to start by offering a few words of description about Green Faith, about saying how we think this current dual crisis of COVID and climate change should be addressed, and what role faith communities have to play in that. Green Faith is an interfaith environmental organization, and I was very moved several years ago to realize that the idea for an overnight vigil in Rio during the Earth Summit in 1992, where the inspiration among US visitors to Rio for that summit was born. They went to the event that was organized in part by ICER. They realized that there had to be a multi-faith response to the climate crisis in New Jersey, in the United States. And they came back home to try to get that started. And Green Faith has grown over the years from being a locally focused group to a group that works nationally in the United States, and now to a group that is helping create an international multi-faith climate and environmental justice network, with ICER as our partner in Brazil. We focus on education and training for people of faith and religious leaders because they are very often hungry for and in need of education and training that links science and theology, that helps these different worlds connect meaningfully and faithfully and with a deep respect for science. We help these leaders connect their congregations, their faith communities, with civil society activists and movements to address climate change. Moema mentioned that we've been involved for many years in the fossil fuel divestment movement. We're now involved as ICER is in an initiative called the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which is working to train and mobilize religious communities to address tropical deforestation in Brazil and Colombia and Peru, in Indonesia, and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So we believe very strongly that religious communities, when they are educated and trained, when they're in dialogue with each other, with the scientific community, and with civil society leaders, can play a really important role. All of that is fine and is good and is important. But I think that at this particular moment in history, and I will say that I'm very influenced by the deep concern about the election that will happen soon in the United States, we must recognize that the struggles and the challenges that we face as a human family are due to three interconnected threats. One is the threat of governments that are either ineffective on climate change and on COVID, or more commonly, are increasingly authoritarian, that are increasingly restricting the rights of indigenous peoples, of cultural minorities, of racial minorities, and of women. So one threat is the growing danger that governments pose around the world. A second threat, very connected to the first, is the growing power of extractive industries, even at the same time that these industries are making proclamations on an almost weekly basis about how much they care about the climate and how much they care about the environment. One example is that 5 years ago at the Paris Agreement, all the world's major banks pledged to increase their efforts to fight climate change, but research has shown clearly that they have increased their funding for new fossil fuel infrastructure. And we see rates of deforestation increasing also. So alongside corrupt or authoritarian or ineffective governments, we have the growing power of extractive industries. The third threat, I am sorry to say as a person of faith, is from extreme cultural and religious forces which reinforce the worldview of extractive industries and authoritarian governments. We see this very clearly here in the United States, where very powerful Christian groups are supportive of President Trump in a way that, as a person of faith, it is extremely difficult to reconcile, and are also very supportive of extractive industries. I would venture to say, though I am no expert, that this same pattern is part of the Brazilian context. And indeed, we see it in many countries all over the world, in Indonesia, in India, in many other places. And this third part of the problem, the misuse of religion, the turning of religion into a weapon against the planet and against the future, is something that we as people of faith must contend with and must speak to. We obviously have seen religion used as a weapon against indigenous peoples for many centuries. We've seen religion used as a weapon against enslaved populations for many centuries. Now religion is being used as a weapon against the planet. And so our belief at Green Faith is that we must acknowledge collectively our profound sense of concern about this. We must commit to building local grassroots power, communities of care and resilience at a level that we have never done before. And we must find ways to come together across different national boundaries, religious boundaries, to recreate the cultures that give birth to our politics and that give birth to the businesses and the code of ethics by which businesses must operate. This is a very enormous task, but the future of life is at stake. And we are eager to be in collaboration with faith communities around the globe in relationship to this. In the next month and a half, with ISER and with partners in a dozen other countries, we'll be launching the Green Faith International Network, which will be a global grassroots leadership development network, pressing for policies and leadership from religious communities on these issues. We are, without a doubt, in this struggle together. We recognize, all of us, regardless of where we are located, the work that needs to be done. We know that the only way we can do this is together. And so the hope that a gathering like this gives me is that we can recognize the seriousness and the nature of the threats that we face, recognize that our faith, our spirituality, in healthy dialogue with science, can give us a vision for a much better future, and to find new levels of resolve and commitment and hope to do what we need to do. I believe it is an Irish saying, is this a private fight or can anybody get involved? And I'd like to close by saying that we are privileged to be in this struggle together with our colleagues in Brazil. So thank you so much for the chance to be together, and I look forward to hearing what others will say.
Muito obrigado, reverendo, por suas palavras.
Thank you very much, Reverend,
muito claras, diretas, muito
for your
Seu
words.
microfone, tem que ligar o
Very
microfone,
clear,
Fábio.
E eu
very
liguei.
direct. It seems like Fabio is on mute. So thank you very much, Reverend, for your very clear exposition. The only thing I would add is about the reflection you made that many times religion, it serves diverse interests, and science historically is also used by diverse interests. And that is exactly why we need to work together, because it is not conceivable that so many religions who love a people and nature and others, this principle can be applied to everything. And this is why there is a lot of space for us to collaborate and help the changes our planet requires. So thank you, Reverend. We know you will have to leave us before we end our debate, but I would like to leave our gratefulness for you. And with that, I give the floor to my dear friend Lourdes Brazil. Lourdes, I'm anxious to hear you again. Please feel free to begin. Good afternoon to all of you. It is an enormous pleasure to be with you. I would like to thank for the invitation to share some fragments of our social and environmental issues. Climate change is the topic of the day, very important, and some of the impacts on human beings and on other beings are being disseminated, impacts on biodiversity, the destruction of the balance of our ecosystems, many impacts that are being identified and others that are still to be found. I had the opportunity to guide a master's thesis in my city, produced by a student from Sweden, and she asked me how the population was adjusting to climate change, and her field work was carried out in a slum in the city of Niterói. So we visited some families in the slum, and the impacts of climate change were felt. By the way, here in Brazil, one impact are strong rains, very heavy rains that we had in December and January. This week, we had very strong rains also. And the people who live in these spaces of exclusion of lack of justice in the peripheries of the cities have been strongly impacted. And in these communities, many families are led by women. And they have described to us how they used up a big part of the household income to fix roofs, to build barriers on doors and windows, changing the positions of doors and windows. And some young mothers told us that they were forced to leave school and college because in the end of the year they had to invest in a renovation in their houses. So climate change deepens social inequality in Brazil because of this need to use their income. We've been hearing news about climate change. Some entities like the IPCC and the different civil society organizations, many things going on around the world. The Conference of the Parties, which every year bring us news. And in face of these news and of these reports, it is possible for us to identify some groups and how they are assimilating climate change. Of course, we have the group of skepticals, people who even facing all evidences, they don't believe in climate change. They say that it's not happening, that it's an invention of scientists, that it is an international agreement, a spurious agreement, and unfortunately we have many government members in this group as well as people of faith. We also have those who set off the alarm, who believe in climate change, but who announce extremely dramatic consequences that simply do not help. These dramatic reports mobilize people, but what can we do when we are facing such large catastrophes? We also have another group that is impacted by climate change, but which simply cannot make a link, draw a link between their everyday life and climate change. During the period when we visited the slum in Niterói for this field work, people said, we are feeling that it is much warmer now and that rains are much heavier. When I am at work and I see that the weather is changing, I get in despair because it rains so much heavier than it did when I was a child. But they simply don't link that to climate change. They know that something strange is going on with the climate, but they don't know what it is. There is yet another group of people who gets distorted and stereotyped information. They know something is going on, but they don't have or seek necessary information. And therefore, this is a lot of work to be done because we believe that when people start to get more and more reliable information, they will begin to act. In this group, we have many components of our faith groups. I am from the Baptist Church. Unfortunately, there is a very big distance between the churches and science. Churches rarely give this information. Very rarely we hear a sermon that is based on scientific data and they trace similarities between what is going on and the Bible. And we have the group that is well informed and that is acting. Within this group, there are some religious communities. I have the privilege of participating in some of these movements, and what happens is that in this movement we have the National Council of Evangelical Churches, which is an old movement, which has gathered some churches, and they work. They produce documents and some guidance that is being put to practice. The base of this group is in Brasilia, and it's a very interesting one. We also have the movement of churches that are eco-citizens. This movement was also created during the 1992 World Summit, gathering people from São Paulo and Mato Grosso do Sul mainly, besides other groups. But there are still very small groups, individual groups. We don't see them moving like the evangelical front leading them. As evangelical Christians, we believe in God the Creator, a God who has put this wonderful universe of ours to function, and that we were not created to rule it, to devastate it, to put it at our disposal, but rather to care for it, so that all forms of life could live together in harmony. Isaiah 45:18, I usually recite the second part, saying that God created earth not to be chaos, but to be inhabited, and to be inhabited by all forms of life, and well inhabited. Unfortunately, this does not happen. We are experiencing a period of destruction, of degradation, and our religious groups are still not sufficiently mobilized to carry out this work. Between 2007 and 2010, I was part of the Southern Region Evangelical Seminar. I taught practices of environmental education, and I had the opportunity to develop and work with environmental issues. All my students took some of these activities to their own churches and implemented them. One very interesting thing we did was a planting campaign. We planted sprouts that were distributed throughout Rio, São Paulo, and some other states that were involved. But it was very individual work, very hard to take onwards, because it was not part of the commitment of these Christian institutions. So when we have somebody who buys the idea and takes it onward, it happens. But if that person moves away or for some reason cannot take it onwards, it simply is interrupted. Currently, there is a movement called Renew Our World. It is a global movement of Christians who are committed and really concerned with the level of degradation in our planet and with how it has been impacting the creations of God. People die, species disappear, and with a deepening of poverty and inequality as a result. This movement is also present in Brazil. I am a part of it. Tomorrow I will be participating in a live called How to Promote This in Times of Pandemic, or how to promote delight in times of pandemic. We believe we need to be more aware so that people can focus on caring for our planet. Renew Our World is made up of different churches, of different faiths, all over Brazil. We keep permanent dialogue, and now we are in the time of creation, for which the topic is the celebration of Earth, new hopes, new dreams, new possibilities. And We are betting heavily on this time of creation movement because the pandemic is showing us how serious the situation has become, and that we can no longer simply sit back and celebrate events that are linked to the environment, the day of the earth, the day of the tree, the day of water, but we need a deeper involvement and commitment. And for that, we need that our preachers and ministers include this aspect in their training. After they are prepared, they cannot seek specializations on their own because they might even have the idea, but sooner or later, if their congregation is not clear about this, if they don't understand that this is a responsibility and it should be part of the church's mission, it will be very hard for this preacher to convince them. We are managing to conquer people little by little, people who begin to read about it and who realize that in the space of their church, of their community, it is possible to go into these discussions because we cannot simply leave it to one or another individual who act alone. So with this movement, Renew Our World, our hopes have grown. We've been organizing lives and meetings, and it's very interesting that always somebody comes up and says, oh, my church is doing that up in the Northeast or up in the South or in Minas Gerais in the center. I am part of a group that has planted trees, that works on water issues, that works on the production of solid waste and consumerism. So we miss a more organized communion. And I believe that one of the steps of our Renew Our World movement is exactly to understand what groups are doing and how their small, faraway community is producing results with these small actions, so that besides informing other people, we can replicate them in other places. Because there are other groups who want to do something, but they don't know where to begin. How can I start this in my church? What do I do? And it's interesting that many churches, especially in the peripheries, have been working in their own communities, facing the impacts, the consequences. But the churches need to participate and to start attacking the causes of the impacts, educating their groups for sustainability so that they can understand how their everyday life, small actions practiced at home, do produce an impact. Oh, because I only produce 1 kilogram of waste per day. But if we put all of it, all these 1 kilograms together in the whole community, we will see a big impact. There was one church in a district in Rio. They wanted to do some work during the World Summit, and they called the neighborhood to collect their garbage, and the religious leader of the church suggested that they worked with this garbage, with the waste. So they analyzed all the garbage that was produced by the church. They stopped using disposable products, and then they spread the work throughout the neighborhood. And they began to collect waste and donate it to the waste collectors cooperatives. And it was a very interesting work. The surroundings of the church became cleaner, people became more conscious of their waste, and the cooperative had enjoyed a raise in the in the volume of waste they received, and they also organized a planting of trees around the church. So there is a lot that can be done. Unfortunately, some groups work with, when they see that they need to work with science, they say, no, I'm not doing that because this is against our principles. Climate change is something that is in the Bible. It is a fatality. It will happen. Everybody, the whole world will be destroyed, and we don't have to worry about it. But this is changing, and we are beginning to overcome this. It is education that we need. The more information, the more availability of information, the more people will begin to understand that it is concerning, but that it is not a catastrophe to the point that it's no use to do anything. That if we get together, we will have solutions for the short, mid, and long term. And the pandemic, we know that deforestation is an important factor contributing to the pandemic. The breeding of animals at industrial levels, and a series of other things that need to be discussed. It took us some centuries to reach the current situation, and we need to rush and start to discuss. And the spaces of our religious communities are privileged, and they can do a very important work. Thank you, Lourdes, very much. As you emphasized so properly, it is a matter of constant dialogue, not only in the religious groups, but also with the scientific communities. And there is a passage in the Bible that I appreciate. Adam is the caretaker of the Garden of Eden, because we love nature too, and it helps to remember that. An ancient German philosopher from the 16th century, Jacob Boehme, he said that Adam spoke the language of God, of angels, and of nature. And he said that in mankind, when we finally relearn this language, we will finally see heaven and paradise. So we are part of nature, and we keep forgetting it. And hearing you, I remembered this passage. Yes, we need to establish dialogues. Here at Genesis, we are working on a concept of conscious approximation of re-delighting nature, not as it happened before, but being delighted with a plant, a flower, an animal. In the book of or in our headquarters at Genesis, we have many bats, and people are afraid of them. But there is no justice is made to bats, because they are responsible for distributing seeds. So these are things that we need to be better informed, and to have a new delight for these things of nature. Fabio, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to say goodbye to Reverend Fletcher. I believe he will be leaving us in a couple of minutes. Reverend, once again, thank you very much. And since you're leaving us, would you like to share any last ideas before you leave?
Solely that I hope that this conversation and this collaboration can continue, because the only way we can create the future that we need is to work together. So Together we can, and thank you so much.
Muito obrigado, reverendo. Um prazer conhecê-lo.
Thank you, Reverend. Very pleased to meet you. And now I am anxious to hear Mother Liliana Araújo. Very nice to meet you remotely, and we are anxious to hear your words. Please. Good afternoon, everybody. Greetings to all those who are involved in the organization, speakers, participants. Very good to be a part of this initiative to promote environmental awareness, awareness against climate change, and the way each one can bring this to their communities, such an urgent case. I worship this day. I worship our ancestors. I worship the first being that was created all the way to the present. I worship science and technology that bring more light to our faith, and all those who are engaged in collective movements who respect and understand the different forms through which we can evolve and make this a better world. The Afro-Brazilian traditions do not understand separately beings and forms of life. We say that everything is supplementary. The I is the same as we. This is how we learned from our ancestors, and this is what we teach to the new generations. And with that, we maintain our traditions, our culture, and our life, and our survival. In our faith, there is a God creator, and the participants of this creation are the deities that we call orishas. They are expressed in nature, each one with its own representation. If we do not take care of these expressions, we will not have a faith. Our faith will be over. Our existence will end because we depend on this to exist. The environment is our priority. We bring the awareness of bringing part of it. Therefore, we have to take care of it and preserve its continuity. It is our responsibility. It is our conduct, knowing that we are co-creators of our current reality. We understand that we need to integrate, to evolve collectively, spiritually. As religious people, we are persevering and we are hopeful. We are a people of, we are warriors, and we need to understand that in our communities, everything that is done to benefit the quality of our existence and our relationship with all diversities as well as social and economic and political issues. The environment is our priority beyond discrimination and intolerance suffered by our people. In our communions, we offer an exchange of energy, and the most important thing for this is integrity. And how can we seek a cure through a plant if it has been destroyed by fire or if it has been contaminated by pesticides? There are some things that are essential for us. Our activities in the forest are very important to preserve our lives. We need the full context. We need the plants, we need their leaves, their roots. We need to walk on soil. We need animals, we need fish, water, rivers, the sea, the rainwater. We need to absorb the energy from the sun. We need to breathe a clean air, free of pollution. This is what makes up our vital energy and gives us our vital strength and our balance, both physical and spiritual. It is what we received from our ancestors, and it is our duty and obligation to care for them and to leave them untouched for our descendants. In our way of life, we want to attain a sacred goal, and our conduct must be an example. For we get prepared for our communion and to offer our gifts. We clean ourselves. We worship the water and the leaves that are at our service and that we use for this exchange of energy. When we prepare our food, besides praying and worshiping, we offer our food in pots that are made consciously with fibers, with mud, ceramics, everything that will be absorbed by nature. And the leftovers of our gifts that have been delivered to receive energy, we return them to the earth, because this is how we exist. From the collection of grains, of leaves, the participation of those who help, the fire and the water that is used to cook our food, the joy in sharing, the gratefulness for receiving these gifts from earth. We want to return all these materials to the earth so that earth can also be strengthened, can continue to be fertile, more and more fertile, so that it can wait for the next planting season. If we don't think about this not only as a ritual but as preservation, our people will be extinguished. Between faith and science that lead us to believe in better days, we find warnings. This is a very important topic that cannot be discussed only when we experience crises and emergencies as we are now. There is an urgency in talking about and solving environmental issues when tragedies happen. But the world we live is also filled with good things. We have so many good things that are offered to us. We need to have vision and to enjoy everything that is offered to us with dignity and with balance between nature and the human being. We also need laws to ensure that all this can happen. As with other religions and entities involved in caring for our planets, we also develop projects and volunteering work for environmental education and preservation. Still very shy experiences because we don't have any help from the government, but rather partnerships and initiatives such as this one with ISER, which helps us to work in our communities, as well as other friends and minority religions that participate and discuss with us. But to make people aware is something that is only possible when we can convey an understanding of the value of nature in our lives. Preserving nature is also preserving oneself. It is preserving our children and the future generations. Destroying nature means to shake energy, jobs, health, and society in general. It is of the essence to educate adults and children as to how climate change can interfere directly and indirectly in our way of life. It is a collective responsibility. It is a search for solutions and actions to sensitize people, to touch people. This will bring about the changes we need so urgently. We must insist on education, on dialogues, on appealing through the media, on bringing this to our homes, to our churches and temples, and to our schools. And this is what will help us, starting from each individual. It's the way we take knowledge to people, the way we educate them so that they can understand reality in a critical manner. And I would like to conclude by reminding you of a lesson we learned. I enjoy talking about water because it is related to the Orisha, who is my sponsor. It says, when water came from the heaven to earth, it was counseled to make offerings so that it would be successful. And what do we see that water does? Fresh water fixes things and helps the planet. If our hands are dirty and we wash them with this water, it will remove the filth. And when the filth falls on the earth, it will be absorbed and disappear. There will be no more dirt, nothing filthy. All dirt will be transformed, and we must act like water, follow its example whenever we are hurt, so that evil goes away. We need to have an attitude to have an alignment for a better life. If we want to be happy and prosperous, if we need favorable solutions, and if we want success to all actions, we must be like the water. We must change everything that hurts us. And this is how I conclude. In my religion, asher is a word that means strength and doing and accomplishing. So I wish you all asher, that our words can be wisdom and that our actions can be examples. Asher. Thank you very much, Mother Liliana, for this beautiful speech. I was very touched when you said that the I, the individual, means us. I agree with you, and it reminds me very much of what Carl Jung used to say, the psychoanalyst. He used to say that the word I refers to everything that cannot be divided, and we tend to think that we are the individual, but this perspective you brought is that the planet is an individual, an I, to us, with all the species, with the water, with the ocean, with fire, and with earth, this perception, this idea of indivisibility, that the we is us, is something that we need to aim at towards the future of our planet, so that we can leave this situation that was caused by mankind. Thank you very much. And now I will give the floor to Miring Zhu Yan. Miring, I can see he is in a beautiful place with many trees behind him. Good afternoon, Miring. Greetings to you. We're anxious to hear what you have to say to us. What is this beautiful place, Miring? I am in my village, Iko Itacopé. Good afternoon, Carudio. My name is Mirinju. In Portuguese, it is Yan. I am from the Guarani people. We are a very large people and very ancient here on earth. So it is important to have these moments. I would like to thank the organizers and participants of this meeting. Thank them all for their inspiring words. When we are able to work together with our bodies, our minds, and our spirits, we can understand that the world is more than simply objects. This is something that we are always talking about in our communities. And now I am talking in Portuguese. We have many leaders, traditional Guarani leaders, just like leaders of any people, of any community, which have the knowledge and the experience and who know the world, the real world, which is the world that exists no matter how we react to it. It is the world of nature. We can talk about human knowledge and expertise about nature, and we can also learn from nature itself. As our mother Liliana described so well, and Lourdes too, learning from nature and not an objectified nature, but nature being a conscious being, a spiritual being. We do not need to discuss methods or scientific methods very deeply, because unfortunately in its own development, science ended up denying the metaphysical, which is nature itself, when it is called supernatural. We call it nature. So those who call nature supernatural and deny supernatural, they live in the subnatural. And we see our mankind without humanity. It has lost its human nature. So we need to talk about this. And indigenous people like to remind our ancestors and our origins, the same as all people around this earth. It is a science that is shared by all indigenous people, people who bring in their religion, in their culture, the memory of their ancestors, recognizing Earth as our mother. We usually speak of Mother Earth in a romantic aspect, like children say Mother Earth. But we are truly spiritual children in a very, very long path to universal spiritualism, of which we are a part, and we are along this road to this universal spiritualism through Mother Earth. So this knowledge and dialogue, I am now studying geography so that I can dialogue and communicate with science. I used to say that the best method is meditation, as René Descartes said when he made his metaphysical meditations. He doubted any declaration that contained anything that was an error. Everything needs to be questioned and reflected upon, as he said. And the biggest divergence between the spiritual and indigenous people and the non-indigenous people is the consciousness of who is the earth, who is nature. There was a religious and scientific philosophical paradigm that treats the earth as an object where man is above earth in importance. The anthropocentric vision where the earth is flat and man is on top. Man rules the earth, rules over the earth. Based on this attitude, so many wars have been waged on this idea that we own the truth, but truth has no owner. Truth happens when we balance all different truths. Not knowing the truth about indigenous people is a lack of knowledge about the truth of mankind. So learning from indigenous people and from all the other people, ethnicities and religions and societies, all the experiences, which is Yangarandu in our language, the wisdom that is acquired through our life experiences. Our people has been on earth for over 40,000 years. So our knowledge is valid because we are here. And what we try to bring to this dialogue is a paradigm shift. We must break this separation between what is human and what is earth. We must do away with this objectification of nature and of earth. Nature and earth are living beings, and they are entitled. When we finally balance the two, we will finally reach a new world, a new mankind. When the Europeans arrived in our lands, they called them the New World. But today, the mentality of the old world is killing the earth. Because when America was covered with nature, all the destruction happened across the ocean, but there was still a balance of Earth's ecosystem, both in land and water, because we know that there is a balance in life. And in that, we must find dialogue between science and spirituality. The word that defines this dialogue is consciousness, but consciousness is not simply knowledge. Consciousness is a way of thinking, a way of being. So these are meditations that go beyond a simple theory or a simple, how can I put it, asking the direction, the path that mankind is following, because our people suffer violent, continuous extermination wars. Today, Brazil's #1 enemy are the indigenous people, while the president wants to sue our leaders, bring them to justice, saying that indigenous people are putting the forest on fire. We have a natural boundary. Nature separates indigenous villages from the large farmlands. The fire did not come from the villages to the farms, but rather from the farms to the villages. So we know that indigenous knowledge tells us that nature today is not what it was like before. So we no longer practice slash and burn without a very careful plan. When the slash and burn turns into large forest fires, it happens because they want to turn that land into pasture. Now they say that indigenous tribes are illegally mining the earth. How could we do that? How could we poison our own children with high doses of mercury? So the big paradigm for us, for mankind, is ourselves. So as long as we don't have the light of understanding, leave this materialistic, dominating, and objectivating attitude and go towards science, understanding all the details and all the parts that make up the whole. We need to understand the balance between oxygen and carbon gas. We need to understand what is pure. When they came here, they also called these lands heaven on earth, as our friend Fabio said when he was talking about nature as paradise, as a sacred thing. This is how we see earth and nature, as something sacred. And today we have to live with these fires. In the sky of São Paulo, we can see the smoke. Last year, with the stronger fires, it was black smoke. All the national and international declarations made by people who are at the top of power, who have rule over truth, as if their position in a political democratic hierarchy were actually the truth. But in science, we know that it's not that. Science is going towards a new path in its quantum physics, in its meta-quantum physics and philosophy. We need to bring science back to this understanding, because indigenous people are being studied by ethnology, by anthropology, but our knowledge is not a subfield of science. It is ancestral knowledge and consciousness only exists as nature. When we understand that in order to overcome the human paradigm, we need to have something greater. So when human conscious finally learns the planetary consciousness of Earth, then we will finally be able to understand the paradigms on which we are walking, that are supporting our being. These are meditations. Prayer is part of it. Reconnecting to Earth is also part of it. Going out in nature and bathing in consciousness under a waterfall, under the leaves, that might open our eyes and our perception, because with a closed perception, the mind is also closed. And perception is not only our five senses, the physiological senses. Listening to nature, I can hear birds singing. I can see what is going on. I can hear the smoke talking, because the destruction of nature that brings about climate change is so visible to us, because we have seen land around us being destroyed for centuries, with indigenous people being expelled from their traditional lands. From my village, I can see other cities being destroyed. So there is a possibility of balancing societies, communities, cities with nature. This is not a valid paradigm that there is no other way. There is another way, and it depends on each one of us, because nobody will see from the heaven downwards. Plants and culture are born from the bottom upwards. And so this is what I have to say, always with the intention not of attacking anyone, nor of trying to convey that I am the single owner of truth. I am always learning. I know that we are not perfect to our eyes, but being on earth is a path towards perfection, and perfection is not reached individually, but rather collectively. It is an evolution of consciousness. We are sacred, the earth is sacred, the planet is sacred, and there are many more spirits and forces than science and physics are aware of. And also some other religions which say that we don't exist, that they don't exist, and they persecute our traditional leaders. So I use dialogue, and I bring what we learn from our traditional leaders, from our ancestral knowledge. Thank you all very much. We are always here with our hearts opened to share and to learn from you in this beautiful network, which is Faith in Climate. Thank you very much, Jan, for your beautiful words. I think that in this week, when we heard so many lies from Bolsonaro, from Trump, hearing these truths that come from the heart, Mother Liliana, Professor Lourdes, meeting Julian, Reverend Fletcher, so many truths in a week with so many lies. This renews our hopes, and hope is a key word associated to faith, to religiousness, and also to science. That is why the work of Fé no Clima, led by Moema, is so beautiful, and it shows that we can collaborate. And Jan, you also said something very interesting. In a space of 2 weeks, I heard our great leader, Ailton Krenak, saying that there is no supernatural, that everything is natural. And I also heard that natural is about supernatural. So you always mentioned this, and you used the word sacred. Nature is sacred. And since we are nature, we are all sacred. So being sacred joins us together, right, Mother Liliana? We are sacred, as you reminded us very well. So this direction, if we embrace it, if we follow it in our daily practice, in our daily faith, in our work, things will be much better. And I am sure that with all the inspiration we got from you, we strengthen our faith and our hopes that we will get there. I understand that we still have some minutes and that we have received some very difficult questions I would like to share with you. 2 of them are very close. One from Cynthia Feitosa, thank you Cynthia, and another from Rosivaldo Pereira. Josivaldo asks us, or he asks himself, how we can renew the world without discussing politics. Well, politics is part of this change by definition, and this touches upon Cynthia Feitosa's question, which is how in your religious communities, how do you perceive whether there is an ongoing dialogue about the environment in your communities associated with the next local elections in Brazil? It's very important that this discussion is being taken to religious communities. So beginning with Lourdes, please. Yes, politics is crucial. We must discuss our production models. We must discuss land use, productive forces. There is no overcoming because we have a variety of fronts. We must mobilize communities, we must educate, but we also need the political front to overcome what has been implanted and which is so strongly connected to the elections and to our representatives. Unfortunately, in my community, this is not discussed as it should. Discussions are still very much biased. As Reverend Fletcher said, that he is so surprised and fearful of religious groups that are compromised with the status quo without trying to understand that we cannot go on in a world of injustice and inequalities and destruction of nature by the large extractivist groups, mining companies, and other groups that are appropriating everything. Unfortunately, our churches still don't recognize the fact that they should have a political responsibility, not connected to any political party, but political in the sense of thinking about different worlds, different alternatives, and different possibilities. Unfortunately, these debates do not happen as they should. Thank you, Lourdes. Mother Liliana, what is the political debate like in your religious community? Not very different from what our dear Lourdes explained. There is still a lot to be done. We lack awareness. The great majority of people believe that religion should not be mixed with politics. We still experience this situation, but it's not true because religion depends on politics the whole time. All our actions in our traditions, we use politics all the time because we don't want to be left back. It took us centuries to catch up with other people in terms of equality. We were very much discriminated and left aside and marginalized. But today we do have representatives who are still not very many or as many as we need, but who are positioning themselves so that we can analyze them and discuss with these politicians who want to represent us and our rights. And we are hopeful that we may succeed in learning how to elect people who will actually represent us. Thank you, Mother Liliana. I would like to bring a reflection about this question. I thought it was very interesting that all of you mentioned a point that is very important and that is so strongly linked to politics, which is education. Education since early age, consciousness, awareness development. This is political work, not specifically linked to elections, but it is work that is done gradually, little by little, and all four of you mentioned this. The work with younger people, little by little. It's very interesting to raise this because all four mentioned that in their comments. Very good, Moema. And meeting what is happening in terms of political mobilization among your community with regards to the upcoming elections. The indigenous organizations, all of them have their own way of getting organized. And we also have a national organization. One of these environments is the Free Earth Camp. It is organized in Brasilia. We have over 5,000 indigenous peoples participating. And in this environment, with dialogue, we have a dialogue of leaders between them and the public sector. And we know that it is not, that this is the time for us to claim our rights and to build our rights. Because indigenous rights in the Constitution only exist because of Ailton Krenak, an indigenous individual who participated tirelessly in the Constitutional Assembly. Besides him, our relatives from Xingu, Raoni, Bayacan, and Álvaro Tucano, Marcos Pereira. So we have major indigenous leaders who were able to ensure the rights of indigenous people in our Constitution. These rights are still not enacted or still not exercised or validated, especially with regards to the territories. Over 400% of the indigenous territories are still not demarcated. And indigenous rights are rights of the earth, because in these territories we will care for the earth. We will not devastate them. So our participation has been decided. In each region there are indigenous candidates or pre-candidates. Where I am, there are women leaders who are preparing collectively to become local representatives, aldermen, because we know that lack of knowledge and ignorance, the lack of knowledge and ignorance of who we are and of how we live leads to an underqualification and to the non-guarantee of our collective rights, because we are different simply. So our health care, before going to the hospital, we go to our pajé in our tribe. But we want to have hospitals for the cases when we need to go to the hospital. And the same with education. We want our perspective to be validated and recognized in the building of public policies. I will not wait for the government to plant the medicinal herbs. They don't know how to plant. They don't know how to gather and to collect. They don't know about our traditional knowledge. So we can do it, but we need to have our rights so that we can live as we must. Our rights are from before Brazil was built. So Brazil, as understanding that there were people inhabiting this land before it became a political territory, they need to have their earlier rights respected. And this is the struggle of the indigenous people. We want our land to be demarcated and protected against illegal invasions, against large landowners, against illegal miners, against hydroelectric power plants, and we see all the bad impacts affecting our climate. Thank you, meeting. Now we have only very few moments, and I had a question for meeting from Katarina Mezarovic. She says that you mentioned an expression in Guarani which describes indigenous knowledge or wisdom, and I cannot remember the word. Could you please repeat it? There is no translation or literal translation for the words and expressions we use. So our words have different meanings to them. So Arandu is wisdom. I am learning Guarani now because I did not learn it as a child. So Arandu is not only wisdom, but also the process of learning, the life experience that involve the individual and nature as agents of knowledge that bring knowledge to us and develop our knowledge. So knowledge in the indigenous people does not come from people. It is before people. It comes from consciousness. And based on this knowledge, our wisdom is developed. Wisdom is not something we achieve, but rather it is at the origin. We have 2 more questions and very little time. So I will ask the questions and I will ask you to refer to them and at the same time to make a final comment. And when you are through, I will give the floor to Moema, who will make a very special request to meeting. So the first question is whether you believe religious intolerance in Brazil gets in the way of the debate and dialogue among the different religious groups. The second one, I'm sure this will be easy for you, is don't you think religion should be discussed in schools? We are a lay country, of course, but wouldn't it be the case of discussing religion and religious influences at school? And with that, we would like to give the 3 of you a chance to speak. Let us begin with Lourdes. I believe that religious intolerance gets in the way of many things. It hampers not only the dialogues about the environment, but also about human rights, about politics, economy, social issues. When we hear Mirim speaking about the indigenous way of life, their means of production, and Mother Liliana speaking about their practices and rituals and how things happen, the cures, etc. And we never sit down to discuss that, or else we have meetings which are not dialogues. We each speak, but the ideas are not brought together, and we don't seem to advance because each one contributes with their own perspective, and then we go back to our own worlds, doing things as we always did, without trying to think about common points. Or even if there are no common points, that's the most interesting part. What other points we could assimilate and absorb, aspects that are not considered in our group, but which could make a very big difference. As for religion in schools, I am not favorable. I think that other aspects should be discussed, but not this or that religion. We are living in a moment which is a big step back. We require more open discussions about general political issues, about how we reached this crossroads where we find ourselves. And in this discussion of how we are almost at the edge of this cliff, what has brought us to this point? I think that in these conversations, we could introduce religions, but not as a topic of study in itself. I think that more than ever, we need to talk. Last weekend, I visited two of my nieces. We haven't been close for a long time. One of them entered law school, and she began to ask me so many questions. And then suddenly she said, I think I shouldn't know all this that you're telling us because I will have to take a stance. And I told her, exactly, you will have to take a stance. And we're here talking about doors and windows. And she asked me, Aunt, why isn't this discussed in my university? And I replied, because these things are not of interest. These things are discussed in public universities, and this is why there has been such a strong attack and reduction of resources, because they don't want us to have our debates. So this crossroads, this cliff where we are at the edge. I was born in a time when child mortality was high, life expectancy was low, there was a lot of illiteracy, and I am afraid of dying in a very similar world. So this in this meantime, I've been struggling and working for the Black movement and for religious movements. We cannot lose that. We have to recover all our history, all our fights, and so that we can know what still needs to be done. I want to thank you all for the opportunity of having this very pleasant afternoon with you. And it is very comforting, everything that we have seen and heard this week. It has been wonderful to participate in this conversation with you. Thank you from deep in my heart. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you. Mother Liliana, please. Well, about the inter-religious and intra-religious dialogue, in my experience, it does bring a balance to our hopes. So when you sit down to talk between different faiths and communities and traditions, and you stop to listen and to learn, you begin to respect them. You don't have to convert, you don't have to change the way you think, the way you act, but you begin to understand and to accept people right next to you that are like you but are different at the same time. My religious tradition benefited from interreligious dialogue in order to position ourselves because we are of African and Afro-Brazilian origin, and therefore we were stigmatized for being the religion of the poor, of the ignorant, of the illiterate. But it's not. It's a wealth of traditions that people need to learn about. So when we do have a chance to talk to people about our traditions, they see that we are not a monster, that we are not cruel and violent, that our acts, our rituals, our gods are exactly an expression of nature. And we have the same God, which is not bad, he is good. As for religion in schools, I think it's a very long way to go. I believe in teaching in confessional schools because religion is something that we learn in our temple and in our home so that we can define who we are. At school, I believe that as long as we have conflicts in several areas of education, it's still not the moment or the right time to have this in schools. And that's it. Thank you very much for the opportunity. You said that we are close to our conclusion, and I would like to say to Mirin that he has my solidarity. I worship all the indigenous people who have always taken care of this land and of this country where we live now. Truth is a lady with many different faces. We need to know all of them so that we are less biased. Beautiful Mother Liliana, thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting you and listening to you. And on my part, I'd only say that I feel renewed after this afternoon. And now I give the floor to Moema, and Moema will have a surprise for us together with Miri Zhu Yan. Thank you, Mother Liliana, Lourdes, Fabio, Mirin, Reverend Fletcher, who has left, but he was very sorry he had to leave. He wanted so badly to continue with us. But it was very interesting, a wealth of exchange, this inter-religious, intergenerational exchange. Meeting also touches us all because he is from the youth who is at the front of these struggles. So meeting is a part of many fronts actually, but all of you touched me deeply. I do not want to be disrespectful to the ancestors, but I would like to ask Mirin Zhu to offer us a chant or a speech or something that can bring us an inspiration for the closing of our meeting. So meeting, you have the floor. Should I answer you or should I start right away? Whatever you wish. Okay, thank you. I would like to say something about religious intolerance. Not only religious intolerance, but any form of dogmas or ideologies that are based on discrimination. Because indigenous people, we don't have religion exactly. We have spirituality. We have faith. Religion would be like our culture. So we don't say, love your neighbor and love this one, but don't love the other one because he's black, because he's homosexual, because he has other issues. Because in our consciousness, knowledge and action need to be hand in hand. So intolerance, religious intolerance, we see a lot of persecution to indigenous culture and identity and spirituality, to African culture, traditions, and education is part of how this can end, but not necessarily religious education. Education about different societies and their cultures, because we see schools teaching about society, but using the example of Romans, of the Middle Ages, of Egypt, but they never teach about indigenous people. So in our struggle together with the blacks, we have Law 11,645, which mentions that it is mandatory to teach indigenous and Afro-Brazilian culture in schools, but we see that this does not take place. So our search is going to the schools to teach about indigenous culture and indigenous spirituality. So it would be important to have learning communities that would not be private institutions or state institutions, because there is knowledge in our culture that will not be taught in school, in a classroom, but which need this care with nature. So one manner of doing away with intolerance is using humility, being humble. So many people would gain from being more humble. So as long as knowledge is synonymous with money, as long as all the meanings are inferior when they are compared to the objectives of adding value, of accumulating and destroying, we will continue to step on our own foot and working against our interests. And we need to do away with cultural ignorance and illiteracy and ignorance about other forms of life, because we know that to live we need nature. And we also know that we are always learning. So whenever we talk, we try to bring our learnings as light. Light which is not the light of reason, but the light of the heart. Every time we go to sleep, we need to connect to these lights. I'm sorry, I lost my headset here. So we need to connect to our inner heart. These are daily meditations, prayers, and connections. And we need to enter our interior world. We need to recognize that inside ourselves there is the infinite, the Creator. The Creator is inside the heart of every living being in the universe. So let's bring down these ideological separations and barriers, this struggle for power. We do not want power. We want the acknowledgement that everybody has power in their hearts and that this power comes from God, comes from nature, and through our individual power and our collective power, we will have a full balance of life so that Earth will show who it is, showing us, opening the universe to each one of us. So we have these words in our hearts, and we need this original vibration that exists since the origin and inside our hearts. It comes from our ancestors to our children, to nature, to every form of life. With the living memory of the ancestral consciousness of who we are, a part of a larger organism, and this active search will open our heart to learnings that are pertinent to the times we are experiencing. Everything that is happening will bring a new light and a new consciousness. This is why I live, and this is why I believe we are in this dialogue for consciousness and for respect to all life. My greetings to all of you, and my thanks for being here with all of you. It is in the power of union, it is with the power of our hearts that we will understand that yes, we can change our lives, and yes, we can live for a better world for all, with well-being, respect, integrity, harmony, and happiness, peace, big strength and power.